Okay, I want to welcome you to the first lecture in the Mellon Foundation Advancing Intercultural Studies series. This series is sponsored, not surprisingly, by the Mellon Foundation grant that was given to the Center for Ideas in Society. The principal investigators are Georgia Warnke, Muhammad Ali, Matthew Mahutka, and Jennifer Najera. The series will include not only speakers, but also films. And in fact, we have the first film this weekend, Robert Reich's film Inequality, which will be showing at the Culver Center, both on Friday night and Saturday. So I want to thank you all for coming today. We're extremely pleased to have Tom Edsall with us this afternoon. I have been reading Tom's work since the mid-1980s. And I just want to say a few words about a couple of his books. In 1984, he published a book called The New Politics of Inequality, a title that still resonates. It continues to be new, but it's also old hat in a way. And that book was about the rightward shift in American politics due to the rise of large corporate donations and the decline of labor unions. In 1991, he and his wife Mary published a book that I consider to be a classic of political analysis called Chain Reaction. And if you want to know about the origins of white backlash after the civil rights movement and its consequences, that book is essential reading. Tom is the author of 8 books, at least that's my count, Tom, and he's probably best known for his column in the New York Times. Many of us in this room look forward to a bi-weekly dose of trenchant political and social analysis from Tom, exceptionally well documented, finely composed, and honing in on the most important issues of our day. So I want you to join me in welcoming Tom Edsall. We're so happy to have you here, Tom. Thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here and an honor to be here. This is the center of the Inland Empire, and I've come here many times interviewing voters. For a long time, Riverside County was a part of the nation that was sort of where you could tell where the balance of power was shifting. And I have spent many hours going door to door, and I learned a great deal here. And so far, I think, from what I see of this school, it looks like a very impressive place. And I'm very pleased and honored, and thanks very much to Steve for inviting me to this. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah, let me. Is this better? Is it off? It's
facing away from you, so.
Is it turned on? Is this better?
Yes.
Okay. A lot of what I'm going to do is to present. Actually, I see you filled up. Is going to be accompanied by a PowerPoint. So, if you have trouble seeing or anything, please feel free to ask me to explain something, or if it's not visible. Some of the stuff will be might be, especially for the back of the room, hard to see. I am a notorious pessimist, so my message today is not for those of you who want a happy camper kind of experience. I tend to think things are bad and that they're going to get worse. I also am kind of obsessed by politics in a way that makes me somewhat cynical. I tell my students that if I am out in the street and I see a terrible accident with 15 people lying on the pavement, my first thought is, does this help the Democrats or the Republicans? That's not quite true, but I really watch everything in terms of who gains and who loses. And that's true with tax policy, with housing policy, environmental policy. And I think it's been a good guiding light in as a reporter, and it may well be for you who want to go into this kind of field, public policy or whatever. Who benefits is really a crucial question to ask on almost any issue that comes up. Now, with all my pessimism, let me say that first, I'm sure all of you voted for Donald Trump. There was a time when Donald Trump was not quite so threatening. This is what he looked like when he was 5 years old. That's, I think, 68 years ago. But enough of this positive stuff. There are two key points I want to make today. The first is that this last election saw something that we haven't really seen to the extent that before. We've seen a lot of the issue of race has been very common in elections. You've seen this way. Most of you are too young to know this, but there was a famous Willie Horton ad back in 1988. Ronald Reagan opened his campaign in Mississippi in the location where the county where 3 civil rights workers had been murdered, and he talked about the importance of states' rights. The issue of race has been around for a long, long time. It's been around since the start of the country. But as a political wedge issue, it really first became salient as a Democrat-Republican issue in 1964 when Lyndon Johnson successfully enacted the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Republican presidential nominee that year, Barry Goldwater, opposed it, and it was the first time you had the leaders of the two parties going head-to-head on a civil rights major issue, and the public responded, and that began a period when the Democrats, which lasts until today, when the Democrats were seen as the party as more racially liberal, and the Republicans were seen as the party that was more racially conservative. That has, in some ways, I would argue, has just gotten wider and wider. What I want to stress today is that in recent years, there has been a rise in sort of a relatively new concept in political science, white identity. I'll get to how that's explained, but these are whites who see themselves as white, and it's important to their sense of who they are. This has often been common in minority groups. Hispanics and blacks and others have often identified themselves as especially when they are discriminated against, there's strong inclination to identify themselves as a black or a Hispanic or a woman for that matter. But the idea of white identity has not really surfaced in the kind of strength that it has until this last election. I'm going to get more into that. The second issue I want to get to is that partisan polarization has escalated in a way that it is now such that the two sides see themselves not just as political adversaries, but as literal enemies. Republicans see Democrats as opposed to their very way of life, and Democrats see Republicans as opposed to their very way of life. You can see this now in Trump's immigration policies and Republican immigration policies. For those who are here and may either be or have relatives who are undocumented, Trump and the Republican Party is threatening their very way of being. But I'm going to get and not only that, these views are not only hostile, but they are legitimate. Both sides are right to see the other side as hostile to their way of being. It's not just a fantasy in their imagination. Again, if you have a question as I go along here, please ask. This is a chart of white identity, and it is also a chart of support for Trump during the primaries. What you see is whites for whom that's over here on the left side, for whom their white identity is very low or basically irrelevant. They don't see themselves as white. They hardly voted for Trump at all. Those for whom steadily, as white identity gets stronger and stronger in the voter, the Trump margin rises to the point where it's 81% in the primaries. So it's a direct correlation. I think this is very important, but I'll continue here. There are 4 questions that pollsters ask now. They just started asking these questions as it occurred to them. The questions are, they ask people to say, how important are these things to you on a scale of 1 to 5 or 1 to 7? The importance of white identity, they just ask that directly. How much are whites being discriminated against? I don't know how many are familiar, but there are among Republicans and white Christian evangelicals now, pluralities, if not majorities, now believe that discrimination against whites is a bigger problem than discrimination against blacks, Hispanics, and other minorities. The likelihood that whites are losing jobs to non-whites. And then finally, the importance of whites working together to change laws unfair to whites. These answers are getting stronger and stronger, and the constituency that responds to these questions is a Trump voting constituency. Now, another characteristic of the Trump electorate is the quality of authoritarianism, which is the importance of discipline, loyalty, and a declining level of respect for civil liberties, democratic procedures. At the extreme, an authoritarian is a dictator. It's much harder with authoritarianism to ask questions about how are you an authoritarian, because if you go up to someone and say, how important is it for you to be authoritarian, they're going to say, they're not going to say, oh, that's a 10. So what they do is they ask questions about child rearing. This may sound odd, but the questions are, when you raise a child, how is important is it important for the child to be respectful or independent, to be obedient or self-reliant, well-behaved or considerate, well-mannered or curious? You can see the first half of all those choices is in sort of the discipline, mannerliness, behavioral characteristics. The second alternative is independence, curiosity. This they have found to be a way to get at authoritarianism. Again, this is the vote. I don't know how well you can see this, but this is in the South Carolina primary. And they measured primary voters. This is when the main contest was between Trump, Ted Cruz, and Marco Rubio, 3 Republican candidates. Again, this line here, the solid line, is the Trump vote, and it goes up directly in proportion to the level that the voter hits on the authoritarian scale. The higher the scale, the higher the vote for Trump, and the lower the vote for the 2 other candidates. This is another similar measure. It turns out actually that a lot of Americans are authoritarian. The answer on the first side of that question, among 31%, according to this poll, answer all four of those questions, saying that they prefer the more obedient, mannerly, disciplined child to the curious, what all the others. The Trump supporters, however, on this were clearly the highest, 39%, 27% somewhat authoritarian, which really means 3 out of 4 of those. Republicans are high, independents are less so, and Democrats are the lowest on this. This is an example of authoritarianism, which I don't know if you followed it lately. This is Trump saying it's frankly disgusting the press is able to write whatever it wants. And he wants to take away what he thinks are the licenses of the major networks, even though the networks themselves are not licensed. It's the television stations, not the networks, that are licensed. But at any rate, that trying to end attacking the idea of a free press is a classic authoritarian stance to take. Now, this is where it gets complex and a little, but very interesting. One of the things that was clear in the last election was that the key states in the outcome, at least 4 of them, were in the Midwest. Pennsylvania, over here, Ohio, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Immigration was a big, big issue in those 4 states that went to Trump. But what's interesting is those states have very low levels of immigration. This is a map of the diversity in the country. And the places that are really diverse, including right here, are basically along the coast, both coasts, Texas and the South. The middle of the country is the least diverse part of the country. Why would they be among the most upset about immigration? This is the whites in those communities. This is another map, same issue, but it's the change in the rate of immigration or foreign-born in the state. The rate of change in the Midwest. That means that when you go from just say 4% to 8% foreign-born, as opposed to parts of California, Texas, and so forth, where you have 40, 50, even 60%, or more even percent. But in just the rate of change doubling from 4% to 8% is higher in some of these Midwestern communities than it is in much of the rest of the country. You can see that the concentration, the blue and the purple, are all in the Midwest. Luzerne County is a county in Pennsylvania near Wilkes-Barre. Obama beat Mitt Romney there 51 to 46. 4 years later, Trump beat Hillary Clinton by 57 to 38. That's a switch of about 25 or more percentage points, which is a huge switch for any specific county to go through. In 2000, there's a measure that they have called the diversity index. That's how likely is it you're going to meet someone of a different race or ethnicity, or how likely is it if you just randomly pick 2 people that they will be people of a different race or ethnicity. The average for the country is 63. That's not a percentage, it's another kind of measure. In Lucerne County, in 2000, the diversity index was nothing. It was an 8. By 2015, it had risen to 36, 37%. which again is only about half the national average, but that's an increase of 360% in the number of foreign-born in that community. So people are reacting in these white communities to the number of foreign-born coming in. What's striking is that in areas that are very diverse, there is much less hostility among whites to other ethnicities. Let me explain, I'll try to. It's an interesting statistical phenomenon. In the Midwest, young, more liberal, open-minded people, whites, are moving out. They want to get out of there. They don't see a job future, and they're going to California, Texas, Florida, other parts of the country. They're leaving behind older, more conservative whites. So you're getting a reinforcing phenomena where the whites left behind are the most hostile to immigration and newcomers coming into their community. Is everybody following this? It's not a simple thing. This is what happened in the last election. This is how the white working class voted. Incidentally, if you want, I can leave with Steve the PowerPoint, and any of you who want to have the PowerPoint. It's all basically public data. I'm glad to share it. But the significant thing is that the white working class, this is their margin of vote for the Democratic candidate, basically, or or really it's a measure of how strong the Republican support was. Among the white working class, Trump set a record, at least from 1980, in terms of how strong the white working class voted Republican. It's 38% difference between the Hillary percentage point difference between what Hillary got with them and what Trump got. Interestingly, white college graduates were less supportive of Trump than they had been of Romney. So his election was really driven by the white working class, and it was driven particularly by the white working class in those key states of Wisconsin, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, all of which he won by very small percentages. Now, this is a map, this is a picture that shows you Hillary Clinton won only 430 counties. They were the big counties. Trump won roughly 2,900 counties. They had all the small counties. She won a bigger population. She won 65 million to his 63 million, but her counties, many fewer counties, and they are the big counties. Los Angeles County, Houston County, Miami, Boston, New York. What's interesting is the counties that she won are the prosperous counties. This map shows you how much growth in GDP there has been in the country, and how does it split between these two sets of counties. The Hillary counties over here, the Trump counties over here. 60% of the growth has been taking place in the Hillary counties. This is a similar map that shows you the big metropolitan counties are now back far better off than they were at the height of before the recession. The non-metro counties, those are the Trump counties, the smaller ones, are still behind the 8 ball. I put this in because the Trump voters were not entirely driven just by race and authoritarianism. They were behind the 8 ball. And during the Obama years, they did not catch up as much as the counties that went for Clinton. This is not, it's harder to explain. Now, we're switching gears a little here. I don't know how much you followed this, but political correctness became a big issue during the campaign. I think political correctness represented to those who were most angry by it the sense among, again, whites and white men in particular, that the liberal community was imposing a set of requirements on what they could say and what they could sort of communicate in the workplace, at home, and they felt very constrained about this. The opposition to political correctness is opposed by 57% of the vote, all voters, but it's opposed by 69% of white men. The only non-white men oppose political correctness. The only group that has a slim majority in favor of political correctness is non-white women, and it's not that strong. But it still was a big factor, and I think that was a strong pull for Trump. This is an interesting one. The first thing asks, and these are all Americans, the white working class and the white college educated. Society as a whole has become too soft and feminine. Trump voters agree with that, basically. All Americans, not so much. College educated don't agree with it. The country would be better off if we had more women in political office. I can't see that. Oh, disagree. I'm sorry, I didn't see that down there. The white men, the white working class again disagrees. Oops. Then these days society seems to punish men just for being like men. Again, white non-college guys feel that strongest. These are basically similar patterns. What's one of the big things that happened in 2016, last year, is that for the first time, the Democratic Party electorate had more people with college degrees, actual BAs, BSs, and further PhDs, MAs, whatever, than those without college degrees. In the past, it had always been that the Democratic Party was the party of the working class way back, and the Republican Party was the class of the better educated. That reversed in 2016. 54% of Democrats, including all Democrats, black, white, whatever, minority, have college degrees, whereas Republicans, this is reversed, it should be the other way. Non-college was 54.8% and college was 45.2%. Now, I said at the beginning that political conflict has now reached new heights, and actually political opposition between Republicans and Democrats is now stronger than differences over race, religion, and then other measures, demographic measures, education and age. This is the intensity of the separation between the two parties on the voters of the two parties on partisan questions. This is a quote. If you go back to the days of the Civil War, you can find cases in American political history that where there was far more rancor and violence. Shanto Ingar, his professor at Stanford. But in the modern era, there are no ifs and buts. Partisan animus is at an all-time high. Now, partisans discriminate against opposing partisans, doing so to a degree that exceeds discrimination on race. These are a whole bunch of issues, but you can see, just scanning it from a distance, that the spread between Democrats and Republicans, that's red is Republican, blue is Democratic, has been getting wider, and in 2017, in most of these issues, it's wider than it ever was before. This shows you what's happened. Again, these are voters, not elected officials. In 2004, the average Democrat and the average Republican, that's the median, were relatively close, you can see, and that there were many Republicans over here who were to the left of the median Republican, and there were many Democrats, that's this group here, who were to the right of the median Republican. That has really now almost disappeared. The two have separated so far. These are the Republicans who are to the left of the median Democrat. These are the Democrats who are to the right of the median Republican. This shows you the process again, just over time. These are questions where there have been big splits between the party. The percent who say government should do more to help needy Americans, even if it means going deeper into debt. Democrats have say yes, and they've gotten stronger on this position since 1994, 58 to 71, whereas Republicans have moved harder to the right, 38 down to 24. Percent who say diplomacy is the best way to ensure peace. Again, the two parties were not that far apart back in 94. Now they are 50 percentage points apart. The percent who say racial discrimination is the main reason black people can't get ahead these days. Republicans, fewer and fewer of them agree with that, down to only 14%, whereas Democrats have become increasingly in agreement with that at 64%. This is the same thing on environmental laws. This is a measure of partisan antipathy. This darker colored part of these charts this is Republicans who hold very unfavorable views of Democrats, and this is Democrats who hold very unfavorable views. People who hold very unfavorable views view the other party as doing actual harm to the country. That has, you can see, has grown significantly over the same period. This is one of the more interesting things I have found. This is too hard to read, but what's taken place is people in red communities and people in blue communities actually have different lifestyles, substantially different ways of maintaining their family, having children. And if you take measures like the percentage of 25 to 29-year-old women without children in the household, the percentage of women who never married, the rate of abortions per 1,000 live births, the number of same-sex households. Some demographers have created a scale where they've then applied it to how states and counties voted. When they applied the scale in 1976, you can see here, it was like a random scatter plot. There was very little correlation between these behavioral, and most of them are family upbringing and sexual practices, basically. By 2016, there is a striking correlation. The more culturally liberal states, Massachusetts, New York, California, all high up here, are virtually certain to vote Democratic, whereas the culturally conservative states, Utah, Wyoming, West Virginia, Oklahoma, Idaho, and then on a scale, they all fall right along that line. This correlation fits with perfection. Now, two other specialists have done a lot of analyzing of how people who identify as liberals and how people who identify as conservatives take stands on different issues, and then where do they differ most. The issue where liberals say yes and conservatives say no, where there is the biggest difference that they found between liberals and conservatives, was I believe peace is extremely important. Liberals say yes, big time. Conservatives say, yeah, not at all. In fact, the difference in it's a statistical measure, 1.42 standard deviations. In fact, a very high difference. I believe offenders should be provided with counseling in aid of their rehabilitation. Again, liberals yes, conservatives no. What is ethical varies from one situation to another. In other words, you have to decide what the exact circumstances are before you decide whether something is good or bad. Sometimes the same behavior could be good in one circumstance but be bad in another. Liberals say that's true. Conservatives disagree. This is the reverse. These are the ones where conservatives are very strong, and really you should start from the bottom. The old-fashioned ways and old-fashioned values still show the best way to live. That was where they found the biggest separation between conservative and liberal people. The thing that these show are how much cultural differences between the left and right are now important as opposed to economic issues. Cultural, family upbringing, that authoritarian measure about children. If certain groups stayed in their place, we would have fewer problems. I tried to tell my students that, but they threw me out of the class. No, but that's a big separation. War is sometimes the best way to solve a conflict. Conservatives agree, and liberals disagree. Respect for authority is something all children need to learn. Conservatives, yes, liberals, no. Now, one of the things that also that involves this cultural split is how much nostalgia do you have for the 1950s? A lot of conservatives, you hear them talk, Newt Gingrich talks about how wonderful the 1950s were. The green is how are people who say things have changed for the worse since the 1950s. The biggest group, the group that feels that the strongest is white evangelical Protestants, then Republicans, then the white working class, white Catholics, white mainline Protestants, the ones who feel things are better now, are Democrats, unaffiliated, that means basically non-religious, Hispanic Catholics, blacks, and younger voters, millennials. What does that mean? Here's the 1950s. Probably none of you know these shows, but Little House on the Prairie, which is this wonderful farm family in the Midwest, and Ozzie and Harriet, which was the suburban family with two growing adolescent boys, were the big entertainment shows of the 1950s and into the 1960s. How has that changed? Now we have The Affair and Shameless. I just picked these randomly last night. I've talked almost for the whole time. Let me try to do some lighter, and it's going to be hard for you to see this. That's why it's too bad. This shows how the left-right divide can actually be found in consumer practices almost everywhere. Democrats and Republicans have become very sophisticated in what they call micro-targeting. They can find out through companies that specialize in collecting the data for any one of you in this room what magazines, if any, you subscribe to, where you buy your clothes, what movies you go to, if you charge your tickets on a credit card. If you pay cash, they can't follow that. But all these behaviors, they can collect. They can, if you contribute to a church by credit card, they can find that out. If you can pay your dues to the National Rifle Association or to NARAL, the Women's Rights Pro-Abortion Group, all that is documented, and that is public information that can be found out. And they can and they do, for every voter in the country, measure every one of those, and they create a picture of, and then they cross-tab that with voting patterns, and they can mix and combine these, and they develop a very clear picture of what are the consumer practices of likely Democrats, people who lean Democrat but don't vote very often. They can combine that with voter lists, and you can also get whether or not you voted is a public record. All this data, it's a huge data collection system, all of which began really in 2004 in a big way. And it has become the big growth area for political consultants, where you develop this huge detailed characteristic of who to target. Like in a primary election, you want to target the vote, say you're a Democrat running on a primary against other Democrats. You want to find out who are the Democrats in that area who actually have a history of voting, and that's the first most important issue. But then, using this demographic data, who are the ones who only vote occasionally, but there are specific issues that are of importance to them. You focus all your attention on that. In the general election, you would basically assume that the hardcore Democrats are going to turn out. Then you want to get to turn out the ones who only occasionally vote. And all of this is done now by very detailed computer analysis. But the kind of stuff they come up with, this is a chart of who watches what kind of television show. On the right-hand side are Republican television shows where the majority audience is Republican. On this side is the majority audience is Democrat. In the middle are people who are mixed. But for example, Scandal is the most Democratic television show. The Good Wife is a pretty good the other measure here is turnout. The higher up you are on this, the more likely you are to turn out. The Last Man Standing is the most Republican show. Elementary is quite Republican and a high turnout show. Leaning Republican is Blue Bloods. Person of Interest. What they found actually is interesting. Republicans like crime shows where the bad guy gets caught off, and that the bad guy gets caught by the use of technology and logic, where it's all a sequential thing, like a lot of the Law and Order and criminal, at any rate, where there is this procedure that solely works to catch and convict the criminal. Democrats tend to prefer kind of crime noir, where it's vaguer whether the bad guy is really bad, or is he mixed, or is he sort of where good and evil are not so clear. Let me just read you some of these other ones here. The Good Wife and 60 Minutes is another very good turnout and a Democratic-leaning show. You would pick where to put your ads on a primary or general election based on these categories. If you want to get to high turnout, like if you're in a primary, you want the TV shows that are way over here. These are strong Republicans. Same on the Democratic side. If you're in the general election, I don't know if you'll like this. Democrats like American Idol. They like Criminal Minds, Dancing with Stars. But let me move on to another one. This is what do people drink? Now here, what's the first thing that people who study this is Democrats like their booze to be clear. They like vodka and gin. Republicans like dark liquor, Scotch, bourbon, rye whiskey. It's a clear divide. What's more different is their brand names for their wines. Robert Mondavi is a very Republican wine. Goddamn if I know. And Kendall Jackson is a pretty Republican wine. Now here, like this is over here. The smaller the size is the smaller the group. Wild Turkey is an expensive bourbon, and it's Republican. But let's see. Smoking Loon, I think, is a gin, but I'm not sure. But that's a very Democratic and very high turnout and probably very expensive Democratic drink. Absolute Vodka, that's a big pro-Democratic and clear liquor. Maker's Mark is another bourbon, I believe. So you can see how these things really switch. But at any rate, if you can find out who buys this stuff and you can target them, you've got a big leg up in a campaign. These are the restaurants people go to. Part of this is geographic. It's not quite fair because Crackle Barrel, for example, is much bigger in rural areas. Chick-fil-A is way over there. Bob Evans is also pretty rural, whereas Potbelly's is urban. Whole Foods Market is quite urban, although the owner is a big conservative. Red Lobster, urban, but right in the middle, Subway, Burger King, McDonald's, Taco Bell. In a general election, you would be looking for those kind of folks because they're not that good at, you want to get them to turn out because they don't turn out very well, and they're middle of the road, so you may want to be focusing your persuasion on them. COSI is way over here for, I don't see where it's, I'm sure Starbucks is in here, but I don't see it. Hooters is a Republican, for whatever that's worth. All right, let me just conclude. I'm now past the 45-minute mark. One of the things that's happened in the country is that the districts House districts used to be very competitive. The line with the lines through it, the columns with the lines through it, are the marginal or competitive districts. The solid ones are the safe districts. A safe district means that it's a district where it's certain to elect a Republican or certain to elect a Democrat. Since 1980, there has been a huge shift. This goes to 210, but it would be even more so. And now the number of safe districts is twice as large, basically, as the number of competitive districts. One side effect of that is to make the Congress much more polarized. If you are in a safe district and you are a Republican, you're not really safe. You are threatened, but your threat is going to be in the Republican primary, and it's going to be from someone to your right. So a Republican who wants to protect himself or herself will always go to the most rightward position that he or she can in order to prevent someone further to the right. And they learned a big lesson in 2010 when the Tea Party came up. The Tea Party candidates challenged Republican incumbents and beat them in primaries all over the country. Many districts they stayed Republican, but they went from a centrist Republican to a Tea Party Republican. And that really brought home this lesson that if you want to be safe, vote right. The same as, to a lesser extent, but still true, on the Democratic side. What they say is if you're in the middle of the road, you're roadkill. What that means is if you're a centrist in the center of the road, that's where you're going to get run over by the traffic and politically killed. And it's the people over on the sides of the road, really off the road, who are the safe people. So if you're way over to the right in a Republican district or way over to the left, you are safer, and you are safe from a challenge in a safe district, if you follow that. So safety has really exaggerated the pressures on members of Congress to move farther to their ideological left or right, depending on what they are. Finally, this is just a quote, which I thought was interesting. Trump has been really marked as the rise of populism. This is a guy who says, populism, finally, is an ideology that considers society to be separated into two homogeneous and antagonistic groups, the pure people and the corrupt people. It's a professor at the University of Georgia named Cass Mudd said that, but I think that captures to some extent what is taking place and we're seeing in the United States. But I would be glad to take on any questions, criticisms, observations. Please. Any thoughts, folks? I think you're supposed to pass out these.
Oh, I think they can probably hear me.
I think they want the TV.
Oh. So when you talk about the sort of rise in white nationalism, you really see that as a trend that's sustainable, or is it more like a death rattle for a part of society that's sort of on its way out? I mean, we saw so much in California, going back to the same-sex marriage debate, where there was actually a referendum in the state that lost, and same-sex marriage was at least temporarily overturned, but today, and that wasn't that long ago. It was, I think, Obama's the 2008 election, and now it's not even on anybody's radar in California at this point.
That's a good question. The reality is demographically, the white working class, where you find the strongest white identity sense, is the declining constituency. At one time, they made up literally better than 72% of the vote. I think they now make up about 33, 35% of the vote. So, and we're talking within our, certainly within my lifetime and with the adults here, within an adult's lifetime. So they are declining as a group, but this intensity of feeling has been growing more so, and I just don't know. I think it's too early to tell. No one thought that Trump could win. Let's put it this way. A lot of people thought that the Obama coalition that he had created in 2008 and 2012 was going to be a majority coalition that would sustain the Democrats. And then the Republicans put up this crazy guy, Trump. It should be a knockoff. And it wasn't. So something is going on, and I don't think we have an answer to that question. It's just too early to tell. And the country is still 70% white. So there's a lot of, if white identity really starts expanding, it could, but conversely, the country is getting more and more educated. And because of that, educated whites are the least white identified. So there are conflicting trends on all of this.
A lot of the trends that you showed have been in our society for a period of time, but it seems to me that the Trump administration has exacerbated these and brought them to the forefront. Is that a correct way of looking at it? In other words, that unrest has been with us, but now it's overtaken us because of the Trump administration.
I would say Trump was willing to go places that no Republican presidential candidate in 2016 or before, no major one. Pat Buchanan was willing to go that way, but aside from sort of the exceptions, no one was willing to go the way Trump went and to the extremes that Trump went in 2016. And it turned out within the Republican Party to be a gold mine. Now, Pat Buchanan tried the same thing in running against George H.W. Bush, as I recall, in the 1992 primaries. And he beat him in New Hampshire. Was it 92, 88? I'm sorry. And no, it was 92. Anyway, no, it was 92 that he beat him in New Hampshire, but he couldn't sustain it. It didn't have that. Now, Trump had the advantage of having 16 opponents, splitting up the opposition vote. So with his core support was enough to win pluralities in the early stages, and then he became kind of a giant killer and was pulled up, and then he could start winning actual majorities in the primaries. So, but you're right that a lot of what has gone on, but the trends have become more extreme. If you saw those charts about opinions where the Republicans are going one way and Democrats the other way, that they are getting larger, the gaps. And the Republicans, both voters and members of Congress, have moved farther to the right, and Democrats have moved farther to the left. They're both moving. The direction of both parties is in the opposite direction, and it's been increasing. So, and I think a good question is, if Trump had run in 2012 instead of Romney, how would he have done? I don't know that we talked about that at lunch. It's a good question. I don't have the answer to that question. But if the material was there,
So one of the things you said at the beginning was something like, I'm not sure I'm going to get your exact words right, but something like that each side sees the other side as hostile to their way of being or their way of living. And I guess I was wondering, and you gave one example where people who have undocumented family members, the current proposals from the Republican side are kind of an existential threat to their families. But I was wondering if you could give kind of more examples on the Republican side, because, you know, to me it seems sometimes hallucinatory on the Republican side. You know, the Democrats are going to burn down their churches or something. So, could you develop that a little more?
Yeah, now these are attitudes that I'm not endorsing. And I think most people in this room would disagree with them. But I'm trying to describe how if you are a white evangelical, you see the culture moving against you. It's like the change from 50s TV shows to contemporary TV shows. And you see that as the liberal world doing that. You see liberals as having pushed the sexual revolution and the women's rights revolution. It's a belief in the Southern Baptist Convention, repeated almost at every convention that they hold, that the man is the patriarch of the family and the wife is subordinate to him. Liberalism does not accept that, and in fact, formally challenges it. If you're a working stiff in a factory all your life, and you've had to do some kind of lousy routine work over and over again, and your son starts saying to you when you try to discipline him, "Dad, fuck off." You say to yourself, what kind of job can this kid hold? You see the kid's life being threatened. He sees his daughter going out and having sex, and he thinks, if she gets pregnant, is she going to have an abortion, which she would really oppose, assuming he's, say, Catholic? And second, and if she has the kid, it's going to wreck her life. And these are things that are felt deeply. They're not, they see affirmative action. They are convinced affirmative action reduces their opportunity to get a job based on a merit competition.
If I could just follow up, I guess.
Please.
To me, the way that you originally paired that on that slide, or presented that on that slide, was kind of as though both sides were true and as though it's symmetrical. And to me, it's important to recognize that, say, some of the paranoid views that, you know, the Democrats want to implement Sharia law, that is hallucinatory in a way that people who are concerned about their family members who are not documented being deported is not hallucinatory. So, I don't know, I guess I had a little bit of a negative reaction to what seemed to be a kind of parody there.
It's not an equivalence thing, and I think, but if you don't recognize the anxieties of your adversary, you're likely to just simply demonize them. And some of them are felt. If you, I tell you, I'm not trying to endorse these policies, but if you're a white high school graduate in Chicago, and your father is a cop and your grandfather's been a cop, and you want to become a cop, and you go down and you take the exam, and because of affirmative action policies, some people who score lower than you get accepted to the police academy, but you aren't, you are going to be pissed off. You're not going to take it very nicely, and you're going to become a Republican, in fact. There are liberal policies that may be right, but they also have costs. And the people who have to bear those costs are not going to be happy campers. And it certainly, I agree with it that a immigration policy that tears up families and would move kids who've been basically on American soil since the age of 6 months is incredibly bad. I mean, much worse than the guy who doesn't get the police job in Chicago. But there still are voter X and voter Y. They're both going to be influenced by these kind of factors.
Yeah, I'm just going by when I see the hands.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I'm a social scientist, so I like to think in terms of, causation, and so I'm torn between asking you questions about, how the country became polarized, and then asking you questions about how it becomes less polarized. But I think I'll stick with the second one. And so, to me, you're kind of torn between a race story and a class story. So you've got the one graph where you have the high correlation between whites who identify as whites or see themselves as white and supporting Trump. But then you've also got the graph showing that Trump supporters live in areas that were very economically depressed. And I think both are true. It's interesting. I think I've looked at some of this data. The swing towards, so if you compare the African American and Latinos without college educations, if you look at the percent that voted for Romney and the percent that voted for Trump, the increase is actually bigger than is the same group for whites. So that sort of speaks to the class
As a
story
percentage.
in percentage points. I mean,
Yeah.
it's a very small percentage
Yeah.
going to a bigger small percentage.
Yeah.
So then the question is of how you get out of this to me is like, if it's a class story, do you figure out economic policies that address the economic decline in places like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Ohio that are affecting the white working class and also the minority working classes in those areas? Or do you just wait for the old cranky white people in the middle of the country to move along, or do you hope that the Supreme Court's going to knock down all these gerrymandering rules and make housing districts more competitive in the future? So I mean, which one of these stories in your mind is the most important to get the country out of this polarization mess that you
I
very
think
much
if the
documented?
issue was economic, the Democrats would have very little problem. I mean, Hillary Clinton's economic policies were clearly more beneficial than Trump's. He tapped into something else. I think the Democrats have a credibility problem because as the party as a whole becomes more elite, college educated, the Democrats benefit from globalization. Republicans that in these states get hurt by globalization. The Democratic Party has become the party of the winners. It used to be the party of the losers. And even among blacks and Hispanics, even though by standards their lives are on average not good compared to the average, the trend line, their experience, they often have very optimistic views, and they will say, my future looks good, because they are comparing themselves to their parents, and from the generational point of view that they use as a base of comparison, things look good. Whites in Michigan and these places do the same thing, and they say, my life is on a downhill path. And then they feel and they see the Democrats as this elitist group, and I think that has hurt the Democratic Party's ability to convey an economic message with any credibility. That's Trump calling to say, Scott.
Hi, Tom. I was taken by that graph that you had in terms of the non-college educated and the Republican-Democrat spread.
Yeah.
And, to continue a bit on the conversation we had at lunch, I mean, to me, it seems so driven by the candidate pairs in the election. And what I mean, and I'll just elaborate a second here. If you run a thought experiment, if Joe Biden had run against Trump, I think the Democrats would have gotten a much bigger chunk of the non-college educated white vote. If you look from what I saw in those graphs, I don't know if you can go back to that. Gore did badly. Kerry did badly. Right? Clinton did well. 1992, 1996. He was Bubba, right? He was seen as one of them. And Obama did okay the first time around, but by 2012, the kind of elitist, but also the Tea Party was in full swing by then. So it was race, but also this thing about elitism that made the difference. So I'm just wondering how much of all of this is new, because it just seems that when the Democratic Party cannot find a candidate that can shed that non-elitist label, they lose, and they lose really badly.
I got to say that I agree. But I mean, I don't have an answer to you in a sense. The party, did many of you see that video of the guy, the head of the Air Force Academy, Jardina, speaking to his students? And there had been incidents of some racial incidents at the academy, or actually the prep school leading into it. And he spoke to them and got a lot of play on TV and Twitter and stuff. And this is sort of a tough guy general. He says, anyone here who cannot treat a person of a different race, gender, or any other difference on an equal basis doesn't belong here. And he said it in a way that was really powerful. And if you looked at the response on Twitter and on Facebook, what was striking was the number of people who said, why can't the Democrats nominate a guy like this who just lays it on the line, and in a forceful way, not kind of wimpy and I'm not saying it has to be a man, or I'm not saying it has to be a general, although both of those might help in a sense. But it's tough for those guys to compete in this current situation. When Clinton got into the race, and he did the best with the white working class of any candidate in recent memory since Lyndon Johnson, really. That's a long time ago, 1964. He ran at a time when almost everyone thought George H.W. Bush was going to get reelected and there was going to be no contest, so Democrats basically, the competition was very slim, and Clinton really planned out his campaign in a much more detailed, careful fashion, designed to be a general election campaign. And it just was a different ballgame. I just don't see that coming at this point.
To what extent do you believe the current heightened partisan animus and rise of the uniquely white Trump presidency is a direct response to the good governance of the Obama presidency as the first U.S. black president?
That's a tough question, because a lot of the voters who switched, I mean, there were the voters who had voted twice for Obama, white voters, working class white voters who in Michigan and Ohio and those places, they were enough to turn those states over to Trump. If they hadn't switched, Clinton would have won. So, I mean, in terms of their record, these are people who were willing to vote twice for Obama, a black president. switching. So how much is it race? Or how much? I think one thing that has happened in part is that race and immigration have now become conflated, and the two play off each other. And so immigration, for some voters, has become the salient issue in the same way that race was for other voters. But it's difficult to make the case that race alone was the driving factor because of the track record of these key voters in voting for Obama prior to switching to Trump. So
Thanks, Tom, for a great talk. Do we know these white voters that voted for Trump, did they understand the policy differences between Hillary and Trump on economic issues? Because we can look at Hillary's website and say she's better for the working class, but did they recognize that? Did they have information, or did they respond to Trump's appeals on trade and issues like this?
I think that this, again, is a hard question to answer, but if you look at, I mean, her political positions on economic matters were generally good, would in theory be good for white working class voters. On the stump and on her television commercials, she did not stress these, and she has gotten, Stan Greenberg is a big Democratic, he considers the way she conducted her campaign to be a criminal felony, is his words, I think, or something like that, that she really failed to focus on this. And that it was a guy, I think I quoted him today in a column, who said, Trump said, make America great, whereas Hillary said, stand with her. Stand with her has about as much substance as a basketball, deflated basketball. And if you, what's really interesting to look, I suggest you do this, is to look at their closing commercial. They both had final messages. And Trump's, for his constituency, is kind of a masterpiece. It really, I think, Steve Bannon and Steve Miller and all these guys put together it's like a 2-minute commercial. And you may not like it and may not agree with it at all. You won't agree with it. But as a calculated message, it is pretty extraordinary. You look at Hillary's, and it's, I don't know how to, it's like staring into emptiness. Or if you talk, I mean, there's there are no calories.
Thanks, Tom. This is very
Now
interesting
I
talk.
know you like Hillary, and
Yeah, we had lunch earlier, and I was trying to defend Hillary Clinton, who actually did win every debate. Even
There's no
if
question
you listen
Hillary
to the
got-
Fox News commentators after the debates, they said that too. So I mean, we can all blame her, tremendously after the fact, but she did win the majority, and it is very difficult to win when you've had a two-term president of your party. So
Yeah.
I think she did fairly well. It's hard to know. Hindsight could be 20/20, but it's hard to know if any of the other Democrats would have won. But the one thing that I wanted to say is that I loved your graphs, but I'm wondering, have you done anything similar with regard to information control? So like bubbles about what people are watching in terms of news or social media. Because I think that there's a missing piece here to, the analysis, and that is all of this rise in conservative media and, and the way social media plays into it. And, of course, now we know about all of the subversive advertising and hacking, et cetera. So could you speak a little bit to that?
Well, there actually, I should have put it on. There was another identical kind of thing on the media, with that did it by Democrat, Republican, and then turnout likelihood. And it's clear all the Fox channels are the red ones. There's about, I didn't realize there were so many different Fox sort of subsidiary channels, but they're all red. And then they're all, the networks are actually, the non-Fox networks are all tend to the blue. They're close to the center, but they're on the blue side. And the New York Times is way over to the left as for the readership. But is the argument that there was a body of people getting basically biased news from Fox, and that they were the ones?
Not just Fox. I mean, it just recently came out that the C4 media, or whatever it's called, that owns all these local television stations. I mean, it's not just Fox.
It's also Sinclair. Okay. Actually, I think you have quite a legitimate point there was a big Harvard study of the coverage of the two campaigns, and what they did. So I should have had that. Thank you for reminding of it. They did a chart that Hillary on one side, Trump on the other, and then they had bars and the bright colored bars were negative stories, and then there were fewer for both of them, light-colored positive stories. The thing that really stands out about it is that the tallest, bright, negative story overwhelmingly are Clinton's emails. The media gave more attention, and this includes the networks and the centrist papers. They really were unfair to her. That is a fairly taken point, and I thank you for reminding me actually of that. I think you can find that, huh? Well, he got the airtime was more complex. She had more money to pay for airtime, but he got a ton of free air. He got in effect, I think, the equivalent of $1 trillion in free airtime. I forget the figure. There is a way they calculated it. But that's I hate to say that, but when you got somebody who's going to boost your ratings, and you're struggling like CNN and MSNBC, all of them are this war for the cable channels between Fox, CNN, and MSNBC. And here's this guy who's a ratings magnet, screwball as he is. It's very hard to say no to him. I believe it was the head of CBS, Les Moonves, however you pronounce his last name, but he said, I don't know whether Trump is good or bad for the country, but he's good for CBS. The amount of money, and I got to say, writing columns, when I write a column about Trump, it gets many more hits than when I write a column about inequality or something that might actually be important. But Trump is a hit magnet. And that's a fault of capitalism as much as anything. I mean, especially when you have a lot of the media struggling, the print media and parts of and basically the network media is all struggling. They're losing audience share like crazy. And when you have that kind of environment, it's ideal for someone like Trump to move in and really crowd over. But I was really struck by this finding about the emails being such a dominant. You have to see the graph. Trump has all these sort of moderate-sized negatives on his. None, the women thing, and some of about 6 or 7 of them, but they're all basically low. And there's this huge one thing sticks out with Hillary. It's like a sore thumb. I think that's totally.
Thank you for your presentation today. Really appreciate it. Love your columns. One of the early questions asked something like, has Trump facilitated some of where the country is going? And I think there are a couple of mechanisms I'd like to hear you talk about. One is Trump has facilitated or taken the lid off of people saying whatever they want, and it's scary what some of our fellow citizens believe and say. It's really taken the lid off of racist speech and misogynist speech and so forth. So that's one point. I think he's made a contribution that's not good. In addition, he had a way of resonating with people with, as it were, grievances, partly of his own personality, and partly he probably found that these arguments work. But I just read a book called something like The Education of a Racist by a Williams College historian. He was raised in the South, and he talked in there about a book about what it was like to be raised as a Southern man. And for decades, the Southerners, the Confederates as it were, had a whole list of grievances, and they only lost because of their grievances. And you find, I think, some of that in the most conservative churches. And he picked up on that, and he's exacerbated it. I'm wondering about those two mechanisms.
I mean, I just plain fully agree. And I think that some of the worst damage he has done has been to the obligation to tell the truth. I didn't mention that. His willingness to lie and to distort, and just like a blunderbuss to just defy that is really a disservice to lowercase democracy. And I think he did open a Pandora's box with his rhetoric. And what he's basically said is a lot of the things that you guys think and feel, rock and roll. Let's go for the dance. And it's not nice, but they loved it.
Yeah. They can be themselves now.
They felt that he was allowing them to think and feel what they think and feel. And what they think and feel, most people in this room would not like. But it is what they think and feel. And they feel that they felt under previous Democratic and conservative Republican governance that they were not allowed to think and feel what they were saying. I mean, what they wanted to say. And Trump says, "Go ahead. Here's the microphone." Well, thank you all. I appreciate it very much.